I worked on NASA's Apollo missions for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared me for the classified footage I stumbled upon from the far side of the moon. They told us the moon was barren, a lifeless rock devoid of anything but dust and craters, but that was only half the story. The truth, what I saw with my own eyes, was worse than anyone could imagine. For years, I kept quiet, convinced that speaking out would ruin my career, or worse. But after everything I've pieced together, I can't keep this to myself anymore. The Apollo missions were the pinnacle of human achievement, a testament to what we could accomplish with innovation and sheer determination. But what the public doesn't know is that not all of those missions were for exploration or science. Some were sent to investigate anomalies, things that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena. I didn't question it at first. A few unusual readings, unexplained blips on the radar. Space is vast, unpredictable. But Apollo 18, the mission they officially canceled, wasn't just swept under the rug because of funding issues or political squabbles. It wasn't canceled at all. It happened, and what they found out there was something they could never let the world see. I know because I was one of the few who had clearance to review the telemetry and visual data. At first, the files looked normal, dull even. Just hours of grainy footage of the moon's surface, quiet transmissions between the astronauts and mission control. But then, somewhere near the 17th hour of surface activity, everything changed. The footage jumped. Not a cut, not an error, more like a jolt, as if something had scrambled the signal. Static filled the audio for a moment, and when it cleared, one of the astronauts was already speaking in a hurried, breathless tone. "We've got something here. Jesus, it's massive." His voice trembled, the calm professionalism replaced by something raw. You could hear the background hum of machinery, the faint crackle of lunar dust against their boots, and then another voice chimed in, this one quieter, almost inaudible. "Is it moving?" I remember leaning closer to the monitor, my heart pounding. The camera panned slowly, shakily, revealing what they were seeing. At first, it looked like an impossibly tall ridge on the moon's surface, sharp and angular, but then the light caught it, and I realized it wasn't rock at all. It shimmered faintly, like liquid metal frozen in time, and its surface was covered in intricate patterns, lines and symbols that seemed to shift when you tried to focus on them. The astronaut's voice came back louder now. "It's not natural. This wasn't made by anything we know." I froze. It wasn't just the way he said it. It was the sheer weight of his words, the disbelief layered with fear. I've reviewed thousands of hours of mission footage, and astronauts are trained to keep their cool no matter what. But this wasn't cool. This was panic. As the camera zoomed in, the structure's details became clearer. It wasn't a single monolith, but a cluster of towering shapes, almost like skyscrapers, except they didn't follow any logical design. Some leaned impossibly, others seemed to spiral into the blackness above, and there was no sign of damage or wear. They looked untouched. That's when the hum began. It wasn't static or interference. It was deep, resonant, like the sound of an immense machine waking up. The astronauts must have heard it too, because they stopped speaking altogether. The feed went quiet except for their breathing, which had grown faster. One of them finally muttered, "It's alive, isn't it?" Alive. The word echoed in my head as I watched. The structure, or whatever it was, seemed to respond to their presence. The shimmering on its surface intensified, pulsing like a heartbeat, and then the shadows came. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The sun doesn't reach the far side of the moon, so everything is cast in perpetual darkness. But these shadows were different. They moved. Slowly at first, stretching along the ground like tendrils, curling toward the astronauts. One of them must have noticed because the camera jerked violently, the frame tilting as the astronaut stumbled backward. "It's coming closer," he shouted. the screen filled with chaos, flashes of the lunar module, frantic breathing, the sound of someone shouting in a language I didn't recognize. I couldn't tell if it was interference or if it was one of the astronauts. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the feed cut out. Silence. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No audio, no visuals, just blackness. When the feed returned, it was worse. The camera was tilted at an odd angle, partially buried in lunar dust. In the distance, the structures loomed, but something was different now. They seemed to glow faintly, as if feeding on the darkness around them. Two of the astronauts were visible in the frame, but only barely. One was kneeling, clutching his helmet, his head bowed. The other stood motionless, staring at the structures. "We shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice hollow. "They don't want us here." And then the signal cut out for good. I remember sitting there, staring at the blank screen, my mind racing. The report that came later didn't match what I'd seen. The official line was that the mission had experienced a catastrophic failure, resulting in the loss of one astronaut and severe trauma for the others. No mention of the structures, the shadows, or the sounds. When I asked my supervisor about it, he gave me a look I'll never forget, a mix of fear and warning, and said, "You didn't see anything." But I did, and I can't forget it. Over the years I've tried to make sense of it, but the more I dig, the more questions I have. Why did they cancel the Apollo program after that? Why was all mention of the far side of the moon buried under layers of secrecy? And most importantly, what did we wake up out there? They told us the moon was empty, but now I know that's a lie. Something is there, something ancient and powerful, and it doesn't want us coming back. The footage haunted me, but it was what came after that made it impossible to sleep at night. After the feed cut out, NASA scrambled to retrieve any remnants of the mission data. What little came back was fragmented, corrupted, almost like something had deliberately tampered with the files. Audio recordings were garbled, punctuated by bursts of static and strange low-frequency tones. Visuals were worse. Frames would skip, stretch, or distort into shapes that didn't make sense, and yet there were brief moments of clarity. In those fleeting fragments I saw things I couldn't explain, shadows that twisted in ways light couldn't account for, patterns etched into the lunar surface that hadn't been there in previous scans, and most disturbingly what looked like faint traces of movement within the structures themselves, as if they were alive in some incomprehensible way. NASA acted quickly, shutting down all internal discussions about the incident. The surviving astronauts were sequestered and debriefed under the highest levels of security clearance. I wasn't privy to those meetings, but whispers began to circulate. Rumors of one astronaut refusing to remove his helmet, screaming that it would get him if he did. Another reportedly suffered a cardiac arrest despite being in peak physical condition. None of this made it into the official reports. Publicly, the story was over. A catastrophic failure, tragic but ordinary in the harsh and unforgiving environment of space. But those of us who worked in the program knew better. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and the fear in the higher-ups was palpable. It wasn't just the astronauts who were unraveling, it was the entire operation. I couldn't let it go. Late at night, when the offices were empty and the hum of the servers was the only sound, I started digging through the archive data. I wasn't supposed to, but curiosity and dread had a stronger pull than any protocol. That's when I found it. A file buried deep in an encrypted drive, labeled simply Spectrogram Analysis Apollo 18. It took me hours to crack it, and when I did, my stomach dropped. The file contained a detailed breakdown of the audio recorded near the structures. At first, it seemed like ordinary interference, the kind you'd expect from lunar transmissions, but as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern buried beneath the noise. It almost sounded like a voice, distorted and alien, repeating something over and over. I couldn't understand the words, if they were even words, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was speaking. I played it again and again, hoping to find some clue, some explanation that made sense. The more I listened, the more it felt like the sound was crawling under my skin, vibrating in my skull. I had to turn it off, but even then, the echo of it lingered. The next day, I tried to bring it up with a colleague, someone I trusted. He shut me down immediately. "Don't," he said, his voice low and clipped. "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to." He wouldn't look me in the eye after that, and I noticed he started avoiding me in the halls. It was as if even acknowledging the file had marked me somehow, like the knowledge itself was dangerous. Around this time, strange things began happening to the equipment in our lab. Computers would crash without explanation. Data files would vanish or reappear with subtle, inexplicable changes. One night, while working late, I swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering across the room, but when I turned, there was nothing there. It was easy to dismiss at first, long hours, stress, paranoia, but the occurrences became more frequent, more deliberate. I wasn't the only one who noticed. People started muttering about the curse of Apollo 18, how anyone who got too close to the mission ended up quitting, breaking down, or worse. At least 2 engineers transferred out without warning, leaving behind cryptic notes about needing to get away. The surviving astronauts were no exception. Of the 2 who returned, one disappeared from public life entirely. The other made an awkward attempt to reintegrate, doing brief press appearances where he stuck to the script with a robotic precision. But off camera, he was a wreck. I saw him once in the cafeteria, staring blankly into a cup of coffee, his hands trembling. When I approached, he flinched like I'd shouted at him. "Do you think we're safe here?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, a handler appeared, briskly escorting him away. That was the last time I saw him. Then there was the transmission. It shouldn't have existed. By all accounts, the feed had cut out completely, but somehow a fragment had been recovered from the lunar module's black box. It was only a few seconds long, garbled and heavily degraded, but it was enough to raise the hairs on my neck. The voice was distorted, almost unrecognizable, but there was no mistaking the terror in it. "We woke them up," it said, trembling and panicked. "God help us, we woke them up." The higher-ups dismissed it as stress-induced hallucination, a psychological breakdown triggered by the extreme conditions of the mission, but I knew better. The tremor in that voice wasn't delusion, it was pure, unfiltered fear, and the phrase stuck with me. Woke them up. Them. Who were they, and how long had they been dormant? The implications were staggering, but no one wanted to talk about it. The directive was clear. Bury the mission, focus on the successes, and move forward. But the more they tried to erase it, the more it felt like something was clawing its way back to the surface, demanding to be seen. Weeks turned into months, but the questions never left me. Why had the structures reacted to the astronauts? What was the significance of the rhythmic patterns in the audio? And most importantly, what did it mean that we'd woken something up? Late one night, I decided to re-watch the remaining footage from the mission. Most of it was corrupted beyond repair, but a single frame caught my attention. It was blurry, almost imperceptible, but there was something in the background, behind the structures. A shape, vast and indistinct, blending into the blackness of the lunar horizon. It wasn't a shadow, it was solid, its edges glinting faintly in the scattered light. It was only visible for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. Whatever it was watching. That discovery was the tipping point. I tried to report it, to raise the alarm, but every attempt was stonewalled. Files were deleted, passwords changed, doors figuratively and literally shut in my face. The message was clear, let it go, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the structures looming in the darkness, their patterns shifting, their hum reverberating in my skull. And beneath it all, the faint, distorted voice repeating that same chilling phrase, "We woke them up." It's strange how silence can be so loud. After everything I'd uncovered, the air around NASA seemed heavier, like the walls themselves were holding secrets. I wasn't the only one who felt it. People avoided mentioning Apollo 18 altogether, even in private conversations. The more I pried, the clearer it became that the mission wasn't just erased, it was quarantined. Everything tied. To it felt untouchable, almost radioactive. But there was something else. A sense that whatever we'd stirred on the far side of the moon wasn't content to stay silent anymore. I wasn't sure how I knew this, but the feeling was undeniable, like an itch I couldn't scratch, and I wasn't the only one feeling it. The first sign that things were escalating came in the form of an accident, or at least that's what they called it. One of the engineers assigned to recover telemetry data from Apollo 18 went missing. His workstation was left running, coffee half drunk, a folder of audio spectrograms open on his desk. The next morning, his wife called the office, frantic, saying he hadn't come home. A search turned up nothing. No car, no trace. The official explanation was that he'd left voluntarily, citing stress and burnout, but I didn't believe it. The man had been meticulous, almost obsessive about his work. Leaving his files open like that? It wasn't like him. A week later, another team member quit without warning. He didn't even pack up his belongings, just left a single cryptic note. "It's watching me." I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched too. It started as a faint sense of unease, the kind of paranoia that comes from working long hours under flickering fluorescent lights. But then there were moments, too many to ignore, where I'd feel eyes on me, only to turn and find nothing. Doors that I swore I'd closed would be slightly ajar. Once, while reviewing some of the corrupted Apollo footage, my computer screen flickered, and for a split second, I saw something in the distortion. A shape, humanoid but wrong. It vanished before I could process it, leaving behind only a blank desktop and my own reflection staring back at me. My heart raced, and I told myself it was a glitch. It had to be. But that didn't explain the dreams. The dreams started not long after I found the spectrogram files. At first, they were just fragments, endless jagged landscapes under a black sky, the faint hum of something ancient and enormous vibrating through the air. But they grew worse. In one, I was standing on the surface of the moon, staring up at the towering structures. They shimmered in the darkness, and I could feel them pulsing, alive in a way that defied logic. As I approached, the ground beneath me shifted, almost like it was breathing. Then the shadows appeared, stretching toward me with impossible speed. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The worst part wasn't the dream itself. It was the feeling that it wasn't just a dream. It was as if the moon had followed me home. At the same time, strange details about the Apollo mission began surfacing, though never in a way that could be verified. Whispers of an astronaut speaking in tongues, his words recorded but classified beyond my clearance. Reports of equipment behaving erratically, not just on the lunar surface but on Earth, as if whatever was out there had reached back through the transmissions. One fragment of a debriefing document described the surviving crew's psychological state as irreparably compromised, with one astronaut refusing to speak altogether, his eyes fixated on a single unmoving point in the room. It wasn't until I found the term cognitive contamination scrawled in the margins of a file that I began to understand what might be happening. The moon hadn't just taken something from them, it had given something back. I wasn't alone in my search for answers, though trust was in short supply. A colleague from a neighboring department, someone I barely knew, approached me in the parking lot one evening. His eyes darted nervously, scanning the shadows as he spoke. "You've been looking into Apollo, haven't you?" he said. I nodded cautiously. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You need to stop. They're not just watching, They're waiting. The more you dig, the worse it gets." Before I could respond, he thrust a flash drive into my hand and walked away, disappearing into the night. When I got home, I plugged the drive into a secure laptop and found a single video file. It was grainy, heavily degraded, but the timestamp matched one of the corrupted segments from Apollo 18. In the video, the camera focused on one of the structures, its surface shifting like liquid metal. The audio was faint, filled with static, but I could hear voices, panicked, overlapping, and then a sudden guttural scream. The camera jerked, capturing a silhouette against the towering structure. At first, it looked like one of the astronauts, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, and then it moved, twisting unnaturally, and the feed cut to black. I replayed the clip over and over, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but it only raised more questions. Was it an error? A trick of the light? Or had something been with them on the surface? The last frame before the cut showed one of the astronauts turning toward the camera, his visor reflecting the faint, shimmering light of the structure. His face was obscured, but his body language was unmistakable. He was running. Things only got stranger from there. The following week, the lab where we'd stored the Apollo data experienced a power surge that fried most of the remaining hardware. Officially, it was an accident, but I'd been in that room hours earlier, and everything had been functioning perfectly. The few remaining files I had access to began glitching in ways I couldn't explain. Audio tracks played backward, revealing fragments of what sounded like words, though the language was unrecognizable. Images distorted, shapes emerging from the static that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I began to wonder if the files themselves were contaminated, carrying some kind of imprint from whatever the astronauts had encountered. Then came the worst night of my life. I was home, sifting through what little data I had left when my laptop froze. The screen went black, and for a moment, I thought it had finally given out. But then a faint hum filled the room, not from the speakers, but from everywhere at once. The screen flickered, and a single frame appeared. It was the structure, clearer than I'd ever seen it, its surface pulsating like a living organism. Shadows rippled across it, and in the distance, I could see the faint outline of something enormous moving toward the camera. I tried to close the laptop, but it wouldn't budge. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the air itself had thickened. Then the screen went dark, and the hum stopped. The laptop was dead, its motherboard fried, but the feeling didn't leave. Even now, I can still hear the hum sometimes, faint and distant, like a memory that refuses to fade. Whatever we woke up on the moon, it isn't just there anymore. It's here, in the cracks of our technology, in the spaces between our thoughts, and it's waiting. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the desk. It was nearly 3 a.m., the kind of hour where everything feels surreal, as if the walls themselves are thinner. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. A deep, static-filled voice came through, distorted and barely audible. "You need to leave. They know." My chest tightened. I tried to ask who it was, but the line went dead. For a moment I sat there staring at the phone, the only sound in the room the faint hum of my laptop's cooling fan. Then, almost imperceptibly, that hum changed. It grew deeper, resonating in my bones, and the light from my desk lamp flickered. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something had followed me from the data, from the transmissions. I could feel it. I grabbed the flash drive with the Apollo 18 files and stuffed it into my pocket. I didn't have a plan, but staying in that room felt like a death sentence. The hallways were eerily quiet as I made my way to my car. Every shadow seemed longer than it should have been, every distant noise amplified in the silence. By the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were trembling. I started the engine and drove aimlessly, trying to put as much distance as I could between myself and that building. The further I got, the less safe I felt. The hum was still there, faint but persistent, like a phantom following me. At one point I pulled over, needing to catch my breath. The road was empty, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp. I pulled out the flash drive and stared at it, feeling its weight in my hand. It wasn't just data, it was a piece of something bigger, something that wasn't supposed to be uncovered, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I plugged it into my laptop, the screen casting a pale glow in the darkness. One file stood out, its name a random string of numbers and letters. I clicked it, and my screen filled with a live feed. It was the moon, or at least it looked like it at first. The surface was dark and cratered, but the camera was focused on one of the structures. It wasn't like the others I'd seen before. This one was taller, more intricate, its surface pulsating rhythmically, like a massive breathing organism. As I watched, a shadow moved across the frame, too large to be an astronaut, too fluid to be a machine. The camera tilted slightly, and I saw it. An elongated figure, impossibly thin, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Its surface shimmered like the towers, a mixture of metallic and organic, and its head turned toward the camera, though it had no discernible eyes. My breath caught in my throat as it tilted its head, almost as if it were studying me through the screen. The feed cut abruptly, replaced by static, but in those final moments, something appeared in the lower corner, a set of coordinates. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my mind racing. The coordinates didn't correspond to the moon, they were on Earth. My pulse quickened as I copied them into a mapping program, and the location appeared, a remote site in the Nevada desert, not far from a decommissioned research facility. I didn't stop to think. I drove through the night, the empty highways stretching endlessly under a black sky. The hum grew louder the closer I got, not just in my ears but in my skull, a vibration that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. By the time I reached the site, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. The facility was nothing more than a collection of abandoned buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence. It looked forgotten, but I knew better. As I approached, the hum intensified, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The gate was unlocked, swinging open with a groan of rusted metal. Inside, the buildings were empty, their windows shattered, their walls covered in peeling paint, but the hum was deafening now, coming from somewhere underground. I found the hatch hidden beneath a layer of dirt and debris. It was heavy, but with enough effort, it creaked open, revealing a metal ladder descending into darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. The air grew colder as I climbed down, the hum vibrating through the walls. At the bottom, I found myself in a narrow corridor, lined with cables and flickering lights. The walls were covered in markings, symbols similar to the ones I'd seen on the towers, etched into the metal as if they had grown there naturally. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. In the center was a structure, smaller than the ones on the moon, but unmistakably similar. It pulsed faintly, its surface alive with shifting patterns. As I stepped closer, the hum reached a pitch that made my head throb. Then I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate. They were like the one I'd seen in the feed, tall, impossibly thin, their forms shimmering with the same unnatural light. They didn't walk so much as glide, their limbs bending unnaturally as they moved. One of them turned toward me and I froze. It didn't speak, but the hum seemed to shift, filling my head with images, fragments of memories that weren't mine. I saw the Earth from space, the moon looming in the distance. I saw the Apollo mission, the astronauts standing before the towering structures, their faces hidden behind reflective visors, and then I saw the truth. The towers weren't just structures, they were gateways, conduits for something far older and far larger than humanity. The beings weren't the creators, they were the sentinels, the custodians of whatever lay on the other side, and we had woken it up. The images stopped as abruptly as they had started, leaving me gasping for air. The figure tilted its head as if waiting for me to understand. Then the ground beneath me shook, a deep rumble that felt like the earth itself was groaning in protest. The light from the structure intensified, and the figures began to retreat, their forms dissolving into the darkness. I turned and ran, the hum now a deafening roar. The corridor seemed endless, the walls closing in as the vibrations grew stronger. By the time I reached the ladder, my vision was blurring, my legs trembling. I climbed as fast as I could, the metal rungs vibrating under my hands. When I finally emerged into the open air, the hum stopped. The silence was overwhelming, almost as if the world itself had paused. I looked back at the facility, half expecting it to collapse into the ground, but it stood there, silent and immovable. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I got in my car and drove, not stopping until I was miles away. Even now, I can still hear the faint echo of that hum, a reminder of what I saw and what we've unleashed. We weren't meant to find them, and now that we have, I don't think they'll let us forget. I didn't go home after leaving the facility. I couldn't. The air outside felt too thin, the world too fragile, as if reality itself might collapse under the weight of what I now understood. I drove aimlessly for hours, the sun rising and falling as I tried to process everything. The hum was gone, but the silence it left behind felt even more oppressive. In its absence, my thoughts spiraled. The visions, the figures, the structure, none of it made sense in the framework of what I thought I knew about the universe. But the truth wasn't about understanding, it was about acknowledgement. We had trespassed somewhere we didn't belong, and now we had been seen. I eventually found myself in a motel on the outskirts of a nameless town, the kind of place where people don't ask questions. The room smelled faintly of mildew, the wallpaper peeling in the corners, but it was quiet. For the first time in days, I felt like I could stop running, even if only for a moment. I pulled out the flash drive, half expecting it to be blank or corrupted after everything that had happened, but the files were still there, along with one I hadn't noticed before. It was a text document, untitled. I opened it, and a single sentence stared back at me. The moon was never empty. We just weren't looking hard enough. I read the line over and over, the weight of it sinking deeper each time. The phrase wasn't just a statement, it was an indictment, a reminder that our ignorance wasn't an accident, it was a choice. Humanity had always looked up at the moon and seen a lifeless rock, an inert relic of cosmic history. But what if we had been wrong all along? What if it had been waiting for us to notice, waiting for us to come too close? And now that we had, what came next? The images from Apollo 18 flashed through my mind. The shimmering towers, the shifting shadows, the figure that turned toward the camera as if aware of being watched. But the memories didn't stop there. They unraveled further, pulling at threads I hadn't realized were connected. The strange anomalies in earlier Apollo missions, the sudden cancellations, the cryptic warnings from astronauts who never spoke publicly again. Even the hum, that terrible, resonant vibration, had been there all along, buried beneath the noise of transmissions. It wasn't just a sound, it was a signal, a language we couldn't understand, but that they had been using to observe us. I thought back to the figures in the facility, the way they moved, the way their presence seemed to twist the air around them. They weren't just sentinels, they were extensions of something larger, something that operated on scales and dimensions we couldn't comprehend. The structures weren't buildings, they were veins, arteries, parts of a living system that stretched across the far side of the moon and possibly beyond. And the figures? They weren't individuals. They were manifestations, like limbs or organs, connected to something vast and unfathomable, something that had been there long before us and would remain long after we were gone. The most horrifying part wasn't what I saw, it was what I felt. In that moment, standing in the shadow of the structure, I hadn't just been an observer, I had been acknowledged. It wasn't curiosity or malice, it was something deeper, a kind of indifference so immense that it crushed the very notion of humanity's significance. We weren't invaders, we weren't even pests, we were just irrelevant. And yet, in our arrogance, we had knocked on the door of something that had no reason to open it. Now, I feared it might. The flash drive felt heavy in my hand, as if it contained more than just data. It was evidence, yes, but also a key, a way of accessing a truth that no one should have. I thought about destroying it, about throwing it into the desert and letting it be buried under sand and time. But I couldn't, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. The knowledge wasn't confined to the files or the footage. It was already inside me, a part of me. The hum might have stopped, but its echo was permanent. As the days passed, I began to notice changes. At first, it was subtle. Dreams that felt too vivid. Moments of déjà vu so strong they left me disoriented. But then it became more tangible. Electronic devices around me started to glitch. Radios would pick up faint, static-filled whispers, even when they were off. Once, while walking through a crowded street, I saw a figure out of the corner of my eye. Tall, thin, shimmering faintly. When I turned, it was gone, but the hum returned for just a moment, vibrating in my chest like a heartbeat. I realized then that I hadn't escaped the facility. I had brought it with me. I thought about the broader implications of what I'd uncovered. Humanity's first steps into space had been celebrated as triumphs, milestones of progress and ingenuity. But what if they had been mistakes? What if the moon wasn't just a destination, but a warning? A boundary we were never meant to cross? The thought was paralyzing. Every launch, every satellite, every probe, we were sending out signals, announcing our presence to something that might not care to hear it. Or worse, something that already had. In the quiet moments, I wondered how much NASA truly knew. The official story was one of ignorance, of missions cut short due to politics and budgets. But after what I'd seen, I couldn't believe that anymore. Someone, somewhere understood the stakes. They had seen the same footage, heard the same hum, and made the same connection. Apollo wasn't cancelled because of cost. It was shut down because we got too close. Because someone realized that whatever was out there didn't want us coming back. The world moved on, oblivious to the truth. People looked up at the moon and saw the same serene, unchanging face they always had. But I couldn't see it that way anymore. To me, it was a mask, a facade hiding something vast and alive, something that had been watching us since before we knew how to look back. And the worst part was knowing that it wouldn't stop there. The moon was just the beginning. If those structures were gateways, if the figures were merely extensions of something larger, then what lay beyond them? What else was waiting in the darkness, just out of reach? The hum still comes to me sometimes, faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. It's not a warning or a threat, it's a reminder. A reminder that the universe is not ours to understand or control, that we are not the masters of our destiny but passengers on a journey we barely comprehend. And as I sit here staring at the flash drive on my desk, I can't help but wonder if humanity's greatest mistake wasn't reaching for the stars but believing they would welcome us. The next time you look up at the moon, remember this: the light side is ours. The dark side belongs to them, and they're still watching. Hello, agents. Curious about the most famous and shocking UFO cases? My new ebook uncovers 51 encounters the government tried to hide. Find it in the pinned comment. And if you enjoyed these stories, make sure to subscribe, and there's another one waiting for you right here.